BBC World Service. Hello, this is John Tidmarsh. Welcome to Outlook. Mafia leaders face 20 years or more in jail after a trial in New York. We'll be looking at that today. Joining me in the studio is the backbench MP who was described as the troublemaker of the year, and I gather he wasn't too pleased about it. But if he has time, I'll ask him to join me in drinking a glass of Beaujolais Nouveau. But first, the latest summary of world news read today by Julian Potter.
President Reagan has again defended his decision to authorize secret sales of military equipment to Iran, but he said no further arms would be supplied. At a news conference, the president denied condoning shipments of weapons by other countries, but later, in a statement, he admitted that a third country had been involved in the secret dealing with Iran. Iraqi aircraft have attacked the Iranian city of Ashfaz. The Iraqis said they had hit targets, including a power plant and an air base. The Iranians have reported that civilian areas of the city were hit. Negotiators for the communist rebels in the Philippines have rejected President Aquino's demand for a ceasefire agreement by the end of this month. They said the political situation was too unstable to rush into a premature truce. A team of South African experts has gone to Moscow to continue its investigation into the crash of the Soviet-built plane which killed President Machel of Mozambique. That was a summary of the news. John.
Thank you, Julian. In New York, some of the most notorious gangsters in the United States have been found guilty of crimes that include murder and extortion, and they now face sentences of more than 20 years in jail. That's the minimum. Among the defendants were three heads of Mafia families: Anthony Salerno, known as Fat Tony, Carmine Persico, and Anthony Corallo. The acting United States Attorney, Mr. Dennison Young, said the convictions would help destroy the myth that the leadership of the Mafia was untouchable. Well, I've been talking to Joe Valiquette, a special agent of the FBI, who told me in more detail about the accusations the men faced.
Well, the charges that these defendants were convicted of yesterday involve extortion, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and in one instance, the commission of a murder.
A murder of another mobster?
The murder relates to the killing of another mobster several years ago in Brooklyn, New York.
Has this trial actually revealed anything about the Mafia and its operations that we didn't know already?
Well, for a long time, the American public did not accept the fact that there was, in fact, a ruling commission, a board of directors, if you will, who were in charge of the Mafia in the United States. Law enforcement people in this country believe that the commission actually arbitrated jurisdictional disputes between the many organized crime families in the United States, and also authorized gangland killings and that sort of thing.
In fact, that the Mafia was a nationwide organization and extremely well organized.
That's correct. There are 24 organized crime families in the United States, the five most powerful families being here in New York.
How damaged would you say the Mafia has been by this trial?
There's been a lot of damage done with this conviction. Probably the most important factor is that now, with taking out the heads of the families, we have created a power vacuum within organized crime. There will be, in the days to follow now, a jockeying for position amongst the younger generation of organized crime members in order to fill those leadership roles. These younger people from the new generation are not as experienced in running big organizations like these other people that were convicted yesterday, who really had 40 and 50 years experience. The fact that these new people will be trying to attain these leadership positions should give law enforcement in the United States the upper hand in trying to root out the organized crime that exists here in New York and elsewhere in the country.
Well, what will be the visible signs of this internal power struggle that you say is now going to take place?
Well, we really don't know at this point. We could very well find over the next few months that certain individuals wind up being murdered. There may be the typical gang wars, but at this point we really don't know. It'll take a few months before we really determine just how it's all going to be resolved.
That was Joe Valiquette, a special agent of the FBI, who was talking to us from New York. Now, Thursday is the day when the Prime Minister answers questions in the House of Commons. And when Mrs. Thatcher looks around the chamber today, she'll perhaps be relieved to see that one of her most persistent antagonists is not there, because he is here with me in the Outlook studio. He's the Labour Member of Parliament for Linlithgow in Scotland, Mr. Tam Dalyell. Now, as a backbencher, he's relentlessly pursued the government and Mrs. Thatcher over the sinking of the Argentine cruiser Belgrano during the Falklands War, claiming that it was quite clearly steaming back to its base when it was torpedoed. More recently, he was ushered out of the Commons for calling Mrs. Thatcher a bounder and a liar. Now, that constitutes unacceptable, unparliamentary language. The subject, incidentally, was the manner of the takeover of Westland helicopters. But I think we might now leave both of those very well-aired subjects on one side as we ask, who is Mr. Tam Dalyell, and what's his background, and what does he stand for in politics?
Well, you see,
I heard you muttering no. What did I say that you didn't agree with?
Well, it wasn't about Westlands. It was
I'm
about
sorry.
the law officer's letter in relation to Westlands.
Well,
and I used
broadly
the
it was
word
about
bounder
Westlands,
as a
then.
description of a prime minister or minister, however exalted, who'd blamed other people, namely civil servants, for that which she herself had done. And I used the word liar and crook because, very specifically, she had authorized an inquiry into the leaking of the law officer's letter when she knew that she herself had instigated it. And that's why my last question to the Attorney General was why it was that the Attorney General had threatened the Cabinet Secretary with the Director of Public Prosecutions and the police if she didn't authorize the inquiry. You know, it's not every day, Mr. Tidmarsh, that the constabulary is threatened to turn up on the Downing Street door.
Well, can we leave that then now? May I draw your attention to what I think The Spectator, it was, said about you, the political magazine. They described you as the troublemaker of the year, and as I was saying earlier, you were not too pleased about that. Now, why not?
Well, because I don't make trouble for the sake of making trouble. I simply think that the truth ought to be told to the House of Commons. Now, if anybody had given a truthful explanation of what happened over the Belgrano, they'd have heard no more from me. But there have been a series of lies about it, which culminated in the Old Bailey trial of Clive Ponting. I simply don't think that the House of Commons and those of us who have the privilege of being members of Parliament should shrug our shoulders if we are being lied to.
Well, whatever you call it, troublemaker or not, that's part of the role of a backbencher. Do you see it? To rock the boat occasionally?
No, not at all. It's the role of a backbencher and a party member is to be constructive. And if I hadn't been constructive, I certainly wouldn't have been elected to the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party.
Quite recently?
Yeah.
Are you looking for advancement in the Labour Party? What are your ambitions as a politician?
Well, I think people who are concerned about their own place and position, let's take what's given to us. And one's concerned about issues, and I make no bones about it, that if Neil Kinnock, or any Labour Party leader, wished to give me a ministerial job, I'd be greatly pleased.
If you don't have ambitions, though, what would be the point of going into politics? Why did you go into politics?
Well, there are all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that in public life you can have a hand in decision-making.
You have a somewhat unusual background for a Labour MP. I'm sure this is brought up many times. You live in a castle. A castle with peacocks in the ground, I gather.
I live in a house that was given by my parents in 1944 to the Scottish National Trust. It was the first one that was given. The history is that in 1599, one Thomas Dalyell went to London with James the Sixth and First, because his father-in-law was one of the senior civil servants, the Master of the Rolls. And the Master of the Rolls took anybody who'd be useful to him. And between 1603 and 1612 in this city, made enough money to go back to Scotland and build most of the house in which I now live. Actually, one of the fairly typical career of a hungry Scot, people who did well out of the fact Scott became King of England. Now, his son added to it, Sir Walter Scott's bloody Muscovite, who was sent in the Civil War after the Battle of Worcester, where he was taken prisoner, to the Tower of London. And I'm glad to tell you, Mr. Tidmarsh, he's one of the few people to have escaped.
But the house has been in your family ever since the 17th century.
Yes.
And your family also has links with Canada, I think. Nova Scotia in particular.
Well, the Nova Scotia was the name that was given to a baronetcy. The link, actually, were two boys, one of whom was killed at Fort Detroit in 1763. And the family history is that his heart was gouged out and eaten by Indians.
How did you choose a political career initially? Why were you drawn to it?
Well, to my surprise, I fought Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles in 1959, partly because I was an active member of the party. Went along, there was a leet, and I found myself the only person in the leet. And the truthful answer is that I then got the bug of politics. In 1962, my predecessor in my home area suddenly died, and there was a selection conference, and I made a speech. I often make bad speeches. I made a good speech and was selected.
What was it drew you to the Labour Party particularly?
Partly it was the time of Suez. Partly it may seem fantastic now. It was the discrepancies between the unemployment rates at that time in the north and in the south. And there's still the polarisation of Britain.
People have great difficulty in actually placing you left, right, centre. Well, where do you place yourself, or do you discard all these terms?
I think these terms are very meaningless. I mean, for example, I am for advanced gas-cooled reactors. I am for reprocessing at Dounreay. I am for Sellafield. I am pro-EEC. And yet, that would put me, I suppose, on the right of the party. On the other hand, I'd bring the British Army out of Ireland tomorrow, which would put me on the extreme left.
And lining up alongside Tony Benn, of course.
Well, with Joan Maynard and people who've been more serious about Ireland, simply believing that the historic problems of Ireland will not be solved by us from this side of the water.
You like to think of yourself as a team man above all, is that it?
I have very good relations with Neil Kinnock and many others, and bonds of close personal friendship, yes.
Perhaps that's one of the weaknesses also of the Labour Party. The teamwork is not quite so close-knit as it is in the Conservative Party.
We may be more outspoken, but when it comes to actually kniving each other in the back, we're far more gentlemanly about it, and don't do it nearly so much. The Conservative Party is much rougher, and Conservative constituency associations are far less generous than constituency Labour parties to MPs who are dissenters.
Can I just draw your attention very briefly to a cartoon which you may have seen in The Guardian yesterday, and I think is certainly the cartoon of the week. It's a QC addressing the court, and he's saying, "My client was a respectable, law-abiding citizen and only took to terrorism as a last resort in order to obtain spare parts for his Land Rover." Now, a very funny cartoon, I think, but it's also making, of course, a much wider point. The lack of probity and morality and acceptable standards in public life. That's very much a campaign of yours, I think.
Well, I was elected in 1962, and if senior ministers had behaved then as they have behaved recently, and apparently got away with it, over Westlands.
Well, I don't mean just in this country, I mean the wider spectrum, political life generally around the world. Here, the United States.
Honour is deteriorating, yes.
You find that everywhere, do you?
In public life. And, you see, this is part of what the various campaigns, particularly the Libyan bombing, has been about. Mrs. Thatcher gave an explanation that was far from the real one. She said that the F-111s were more accurate and therefore less collateral damage, less civilian casualties than the carrier-based aircraft. Not what Aviation Week said. They gave 4 different reasons. That there had to be control systems, that there had to be exercises in refueling, that one country had to go along with the Americans, and when others didn't give overflying rights, Mrs. Thatcher's Britain, to our shame, obliged the Reagan administration.
Well, I said when I introduced you that Mrs. Thatcher would look round and be relieved not to see you there today.
Oh, she
but
will, then.
I noticed looking at the clock that you still have time to hurry down to Westminster in time for question time to the Prime Minister. You've got about an hour. But on the other hand, if you would like, Mr. Dalyell, why not stay and join me in a glass of wine in a moment? May I invite you to do that?
You're very civilized.
Well, we try to be in this programme, yes. Right, for several years now, the producers of Beaujolais wine have been trying to persuade us that November the 20th, which is today, is the most important day of the year. Only then can we uncork the first bottles of Beaujolais Nouveau, this year's vintage. But if we're raising our glasses to anyone, then surely it should be the marketing men and the advertising executives who've managed to promote this rather crafty confidence trick. It's quite pleasant and fruity as a very young wine, no doubt about that, and it's by no means one of the greatest wines from France, though. But has the annual campaign boosted the sales of Beaujolais, or even raised the awareness of French wines in general? Questions Hamish Robertson put to a journalist in Paris, Howard Chassel.
Certainly, among wine experts, Beaujolais is not considered among the better vintages, even though it has some of its own great growths. But the positive effect, probably more abroad than in France, is opening up the wine consciousness of people who were not used to drinking it with meals or drinking it with cheese, for example. And in that case, it's doing the wine business a marvelous favor.
But do you think the popularity of this kind of wine, this rather fruity type of vintage, has been at the expense of the classic French wines, those wines which are rather complicated, rather sophisticated, and perhaps a bit difficult to appreciate at first?
I don't think so. I think it's a step-by-step process, because the fine vintages, the Bordeaux's or the Burgundies, they have their own market niche and they have their own popularity, which is not really affected by the Beaujolais Nouveau. But by widening people's conscience to wine and having them taste easy wines and getting to know perhaps more about the wine industry as such, it makes them want to taste and know the better, more difficult, the aged wines.
Do you think that 1986 will go down in the books as a good year for wine? Will it be a good vintage?
1986 is considered already as an abundant year and a fairly good year. The problem is that in the last 6 years, 5 vintages have been absolutely marvelous, including 1986. But compared to the 2 great years of 1982 and 1985, it's already said that 1986 will be a bit pale, but still well up on the scale of quality. So here we have a problem of a string of years which are exceptional, and a year which is good is considered perhaps not as strong as those really superb ones.
Do you have a personal choice of a wine that you would recommend putting down for appreciation in years to come?
Well, there's so many choices here in France. I would suggest that perhaps people should come and visit the Bordeaux region, visit Burgundy, and perhaps some of the others, taste some of the wines and learn to appreciate some of those that are not really known abroad. Because a lot of the small chateaux, the small castles, are very, very good, great buys, not known abroad, and you have to come to France really to know them, appreciate them, and get hold of them.
Can you give us a few examples?
Well, I don't want to name any names, but myself, I visited some chateaux recently in the Première Côte de Bordeaux, and these wines sell for 25 to 35 francs at the chateau, which is fairly inexpensive, about 3 to 3.5 pounds. And I think it's really good value for money, and unless someone is a real expert, they will really appreciate these wines. It's not the top of the market, but then again, I visited the great chateaux in the Médoc, and there you can buy wine for 25 to 35 pounds a bottle, and it's absolutely superb. So you have your choice. Everything is available. I think it's best to come to France and do it on the ground.
Now, France, of course, is not the only region in the world to produce really good wines. Places like California, of course, are fast coming up. How is the French wine industry coping with this challenge?
Well, the French tend to say that their wines is the best no matter what improvements are made in California, Chilean, or South African wines. But there's been a blind tasting contest recently, and the French were shocked because the California wines generally had a higher rating than their own great growths from the Médoc. And they claimed that, well, it wasn't actually the proper bottles that were tasted. But it shows you there's a general improvement in quality, both in France and abroad, in the quality of wine due to scientific progress and new ways of creating these wines. So I think generally the French are coming up, and so is everyone else, and it's to the consumer's advantage.
What about price? Good wine in the past has always been seen as something of a luxury. Do you think the new technology going into the manufacture of wine is going to bring the price down appreciably?
I don't think so, because you have the basic raw material, which is the grape, and in the fine wine-growing areas, you don't want to grow too much because it decreases the quality. There has been an upward spiral in the prices of wine these last few years because the vintages have been good, and there's been a lot of criticism that it's actually holding down demand. And just recently, in mid-November, at the Burgundy wine auction, the price of new Burgundy wine dropped by 50%. Of course, last year it rose by 80%, but it shows you that this market is very volatile and also very speculative. In the mid-70s, there was a major crash, which has now been forgotten, but people say that the price has to be brought into line with consumer possibilities, and sometimes it does get out of hand.
Howard Chissel, who's in Paris, where he's probably already opened his bottle of Beaujolais Nouveau. We've just opened ours. Tam Dalyell, who's still with me, has already tried it. I'm just pouring a wee drop for myself. Not too much, because I never like to drink while broadcasting. What do you think of it?
I think it's got body to it.
Is that it?
Yeah, it'll be a good year.
A good year. Do you think there's a bit of a hype, all this?
No, not necessarily. That area of France is a very beautiful area of France.
Well, thank you once again for staying, and cheers. Now, in the streets of Cairo, you'll often see emaciated donkeys pulling rickety old wooden carts piled high with refuse. They belong to a self-employed community known as the Zaboulin, the garbage collectors. Household rubbish, food waste, anything they can find that's been discarded, they take it all back to their settlements on the outskirts of the city for sorting. The food waste goes to their pigs. Anything else of value is put on one side. Well, not unnaturally, it's a community that has few friends among the other citizens of Cairo. Indeed, they're virtual outcasts. But a Belgian nun called Emmanuelle has lived among the Zaboulin for more than 15 years, last weekend celebrating her 78th birthday. And it was in Cairo that she spoke to our correspondent Bob Jobbins about her plans, now backed by United States aid, her plans to mechanize the garbage collectors, building a plant for them to produce fertilizer, and freeing their children to attend a newly built school. But wouldn't modernization mean other people wanting to take over?
It's a very good question. I spoke much with the governor about the risk, and the governor is a good man. He don't want that about perhaps 40,000 people, garbage collectors, will be in one day without any job. And he told me that he wants to help, and we begin to train, to give training, that some of them will be drivers, some of them only will go to take the garbage, and some of them will stay at home to receive the garbage, to separate all the things that can go in a compost plant, and it will be good job for everybody.
You've been involved with the Zaboulin now for many years.
Yes.
Do you feel that the solution now is really close, that you've, if you like, broken the problem?
Yes, it is, of course, better and better, but it's not finished. Before, there were perhaps not 100 children, 100 from them were going to school. Now I built a very, very nice school, and there are today in this school there are 720 little garbage collectors in this school. Alors for me that's wonderful, because it is the first step of their promotion. And now for the houses, because they had not good houses, and we begin to build with them. And now we built about 250, but not sufficient. But I think that slowly, all the problem will be resolved, but not in one day.
You are remarkably vigorous, but if you'll excuse me saying so, you're not a young woman. Are you not tempted to hand over the work to somebody else, somebody younger, and retire gracefully?
Of course. That's very important. I am 78 years old this week, but 78 8 springs. Until now, I have no winters, but the winter will come, of course. But, of course, I am with a young congregation, the congregation of the Sisters of Saint Mary. They are Egyptian. And now I have built 3 centers. The 3 centers are in the hands of these sisters, and they are young, they are very active, and I can go to heaven, never mind, everything will go very well without me.
The really delightful Sister Emmanuel, the friend of the garbage collectors of Cairo. Well, now we turn to some of the other stories of the day here in Britain. Here's Sean Maffitt.
The police have been searching Saddleworth Moor near Oldham in northern England for the remains of 2 children believed to have been the victims of the so-called Moor's murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. As we've been hearing this week, the search results from information given to police by Myra Hindley 20 years after she and Brady were found guilty of the murder of 2 other children. They both received life sentences for the particularly brutal murders. Today, the police began their search using dogs specially trained to detect human remains buried underground. The first areas to be searched had been decided on before Hindley's talks with police because there'd been persistent rumours over the past 20 years that other victims were buried there. Most of today's papers cover the Moors murder case. The Daily Mail reports that Myra Hindley has demanded what it calls a shameful price for helping police in their search for the 2 missing children. She wants to be granted immunity from further prosecution. This, the Mail considers, cynical and cruel. Later editions of the papers consider at length President Reagan's defence of his Arms for Iran decision, and they also give wide coverage to the murder of the parents of the soap opera star Patrick Duffy in America. The labyrinthine coils of the negotiations over pay and conditions for the teachers continue to writhe around. After months of talks that ended up at the headquarters of the arbitration service ACAS, 4 of the 6 teachers' unions have accepted the local government employer's offer, and their leaders intend to sign an agreement tomorrow. But the Secretary of State for Education, Mr. Kenneth Baker, doesn't like the structure of the proposed salary deal. He's asked the unions to think again, with the implicit threat that the government will veto the deal. Mr. Doug McAvoy is the Deputy General Secretary of the largest union, the National Union of Teachers. He remains unmoved by requests or threats.
He's asking us to think again. I urge him to think again. If we've negotiated an agreement with our employers, which has the backing of the vast majority of teachers, then that agreement will bring peace and stability to schools. I cannot imagine that something imposed by the Secretary of State will do that.
The government has today announced a new consumer protection bill. Amongst its main provisions, traders would have a general duty to trade safely, instead of the present legislation which involves checking specific items for safety, a process which is never able to keep up with new products. Also, manufacturers would be liable for injury caused by their products, whereas at the moment their liability only covers people who've bought the items. Most consumer organisations welcome the new bill, but they say it doesn't go far enough. Maurice Healy of the National Consumer Council points out that the product liability proposal excludes some agricultural produce.
That is sort of totally absurd, because what it will mean is if, say, a piece of beef was contaminated during the growing by improper use of antibiotics or hormones or something, if it was made into a beef burger, they would be liable. If it's minced up, nobody's quite sure whether they'd be liable or not. And if it was a piece of steak, it seems that they wouldn't be liable. And I mean, that does seem ridiculous.
Well, finally, back to the press. The cartoonists have been having a field day over the court decision that a driver who was given a breath test that showed him below the legal alcohol limit was still convicted of drunken driving because scientists calculated that at the time of the offence, 4 hours previously, he must have been over the limit. I like Mark's cartoon in the Daily Telegraph best. His policeman is saying to a motorist, "I admit you're under the limit now, sir, but we're backdating the blood test to last Christmas."
Nevertheless, be very careful this Christmas and take a taxi, I would, instead of your car. Sean Maffitt, looking at some of the other stories of the day here in Britain. Well, now we'll take a look at the world's weather. And Ralph Hardy at the International Weather Centre at Bracknell has been keeping an eye on a couple of tropical storms.
Yes, that's right. We've Frances in the Atlantic, and now she's about 500 miles south of Bermuda and really behaving herself. She doesn't show any sign of developing into a really vicious hurricane. and just moving east of north should cause very little trouble. But I'm afraid Joe in the West Pacific's a different kettle of fish. That's a tropical typhoon just east of the Philippines, and winds of about 70 knots near the middle may well cause problems in northern parts of the Philippines in the next day or two. In fact, this is quite late in the season for that part of the world, and the latest reports I've seen here from the Philippines show hot, humid and quiet weather so far, but they must keep their eyes open, I think.
I was seeing a weather map on television earlier today showing the old jet stream, which comes west to east across the Atlantic, moving further south, which means cold weather for us.
Well, a little colder than we've had. In fact, the jet stream steering these very deep lows across has brought our stormy spell of weather. And it hasn't just been the UK affected. We've had our floods here in the last day or so, but the stormy weather and quite mild weather has spread across much of northern Europe. Just recently, looking at our charts, I saw some temperatures at Warsaw, for example, 10 degrees centigrade, well above average for the middle of November. Helsinki, further north still, 7 degrees centigrade, and although drizzly there, still pretty mild for the time of year, and the same really goes for the western half of the Soviet Union.
Looking at your satellite pictures and talking about the Soviet Union, what do you see happening around there?
This mild weather in the western half most certainly doesn't apply to the whole of that vast country. Temperatures in the east there are down to minus 35 degrees centigrade, really cold.
Ralph Hardy at the International Weather Centre at Bracknell. Now, sometime next year, I intend to see some great friends who are currently living in Singapore. So if you're listening, be warned. And I think at some stage we'll just have to pay a quick visit to the dear old Raffles Hotel, named, of course, after the founder of the island state, Sir Stamford Raffles. A gin sling in the long bar, perhaps. Not my favourite tipple, but you can't fly in the face of tradition, at least not in the Raffles. Mind you, I'll be a bit late for the big party. That takes place tomorrow, Friday night, when the Raffles celebrates its centenary. Years ago, in colonial times, the Raffles was one of the great hotels in Southeast Asia and the Far East. Somerset Maugham said that it stood for all the fables of the exotic East. Noel Coward was another writer who loved to stay there and dine in the famous Palm Court, though he didn't much like Singapore itself. He found it a bit too hot and sticky, like being in a cardboard box, he said. But there was a period when the British were forced to move out and the Japanese moved in. And that was after the fall of Singapore in 1942. A traumatic moment in the history of the Raffles, which Susan Marling heard about when she visited the hotel.
Special communique issued by Combined Headquarters. The Japanese landed from boats on the western shores of Singapore last night.
The Japanese invasion of Singapore, which many had said could never happen, was a reality. But despite the bombing and the blackout, the dances at Raffles went on. Couples were still bumping into one another in the ballroom 3 days before the British surrender to the Japanese on the 15th of February 1942. And Cunningham Brown remembers that while the rooms were empty, the tables were full.
The hotel had been rather badly bombed. There was nobody about at all. A tremendous lot of smashed glass and stuff like that, of course. Unfortunately, 2 Chinese boys were both dead on the staircase. They'd both been killed where the bomb came in. Nobody else was there. The dining table was in a considerable mess, but the sideboards were loaded with beautiful things.
Raffles Hotel became the headquarters for the Japanese Imperial Army. The Europeans were by now prisoners on a very meagre diet. The men were immediately interned and the women told to meet at Raffles, not realising that they were to be marched to a temporary prison kept without food for several days before the long march to the prison at Changi.
They just went to Raffles, dressed in their high-heel shoes, and as everybody dressed when they went to town. So when they arrived from Raffles Hotel, they were in a very, very sorry state because they had to walk during the day. Their skin got burnt. They were in a shocking state. Some of their feet were bleeding. But in spite of that, as they saw Changi Prison, they all sang at the top of their voices, "They'll always be in England." And the men who were already installed in Changi prison heard this. They cheered. They nearly went mad with delight.
At Raffles, the Japanese were not to be resisted. Mr. Arathun, the manager at the time, was allowed to stay on, but when he refused to hand over the storeroom keys, he caught the sharp edge of the Japanese commanding officer's anger. Prisoners of war were foraging for food too. Many starved to death with nothing more than rubbish heaps to sustain them.
The important thing to say about Singapore, really, at that period was that as we walked in a torrential downpour, we were sloshing along among the banana skins and looking at this corpse of a city. There was not a soul there. Everything was filthy dirty. There were frightened faces peering through windows, and that was all. And as we went by, of all places, the Havelock Road police station, and indeed the police court, where I used to sit as magistrate until quite recently before that, who should I see standing and chatting under the portico but a very tall, very handsome Sikh, Punjab, well-dressed, in uniform, police sergeant, who was well acquainted with me in the old days. And as he looked at these ghastly animals passing by, naked and bearded and filthy, his eyes lit upon me. And curious enough, in spite of my beard, he recognized me. At once he was chatting with a couple of Japanese officers about half his size, and very cleverly and rightly he banged his heels together and looked me firmly in the face as I went by. I smiled and winked at him, and then he relaxed and began talking with them once more. The incident passed by entirely unknown to the two Japanese officers, and to me it was one of the most encouraging things that had happened throughout the whole course of the war. I remembered that with pleasure, laughter, and gratitude right up to the end of the war, and then I went back to thank him.
Here is the news. A total of 38,000 Japanese troops have already left the island. The British Navy has taken over the naval base area. The Japanese Navy is receiving its...
It was September 1945 when the Japanese surrendered. On hearing the news, several of the officers at Raffles took their own lives in the tradition of harakiri. Their names and the names of their fellow soldiers were neatly torn out of the hotel register.
This is Singapore calling. Men and women of Malaya, our brief program for tonight is ended. God save the King.
When they saw the facade of Raffles again, many of the survivors of Changi prison wept. Others, who had liberated Singapore, had a less fulsome response to the hotel.
Two non-officer rank gentlemen from the army came in after the war, about 1946, for breakfast, and ordered breakfast. And very discreetly, the waiter came up and said, would the gentleman be of officer rank? And the gentleman said, no, we're not, but we have just won the war, or something to that effect. And the waiter said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but the gentleman will have to leave. And as they went out, they said, my God, peace has broken out.
1942 to 45, the Raffles Hotel in the hands of the Japanese occupation forces. But I'll be surprised if there aren't some Japanese tourists at the centenary celebrations. Now, animal protection societies get very concerned at this time of year over the number of pets that are given as Christmas presents and then abandoned a few weeks or even a few days later. So here's a solution from Britain's toy industry. How about an electronic pet? Then, when all the children are bored with it, well, it can just go in the dustbin without causing unnecessary suffering. My Monday colleague Hugh Sykes has been getting some guidance.
This is the purr of Petster, the electronic cat.
Make her grr when she's angry. Mew.
Petster is the shape of an inverted pudding basin and as rigid. With wheels underneath, a tail at one end and a cat's face at the other with eyes that light up, the deluxe model costs £100. For that you get a conversation. Well, that's a long word for it.
Hello, kitty. How are you? Are you having fun here in London? You can take her to the disco with you, put her in the disco dance mode, and she'll go forward, back, right, left to the sound of the bass.
Petster's dance partner is Nolan Bushnell, the man who founded the Atari video game company. When he sold Atari, his inventiveness was judged such a threat that he had to sign a contract that put him in legal handcuffs. For 7 years, he couldn't develop any electronic game or toy. The 7 years are now up, and Petster is the result of all that thinking time. Petster and A.G. Bear, the talking teddy.
Hi, A.G. He loves to talk.
A.G. Bear has been tested by children for the magazine What Toy, which used to be the Good Toy Guide, and this talking teddy has a highly recommended star rating. Andy Cole, editor of What Toy, says that the best toys have high play value.
I feel it's important when you're buying a toy that the toy you're buying this Christmas is going to be popular by his birthday, by next Christmas and so forth. It's probably much better to buy the child a policeman's helmet than to buy him the whole policeman's costume, because with the helmet on he can pretend he's the policeman, he can use his imagination.
And it's not enough to be a checkbook parent.
Very often we're all guilty of giving a child a toy and expecting the child to play with the toy without necessarily playing with them with it. The best toys children can have are their parents or other children, because children enjoy playing with people.
And electric trains, in spite of the old cliché about fathers buying them for themselves, are a perfect example of a toy that a parent has to help the child play with. This is the, to some people, musical sound of a Hornby 00 railway. Hornby are still going strong. 6 years ago, though, they nearly went bust. In 1 year, their sales dropped by half. Losses were £1.7 million. They've now pulled back by diversifying into worlds that electric railway fans might find a bit uncomfortable. Managing director of Hornby, Keith Ness, has created the Boo-Boos.
Our little baby doll there is an orphan in the forest, and of course Little Mops is a dog. Found our little baby doll and then sent for his little friends, the Boo-Boos, immediately. And they're the little people of the night who keep children very, very safe. Well, they found the little baby and they took her to the Boo-Boos' home, which in actual fact is a crib made out of a log. And the little Boo-Boos live underneath so that they can look after her and make sure they see her very, very safely through the night.
But it's not really so very far from electric trains. Most of Hornby's range involves collecting additions to a basic idea. With the trains, you buy the track and add the rolling stock. With the Boo-Boos, you get the crib and then all those little people.
You've picked up one thing about our company, that we are more interested in building ranges of merchandise that have the possibility of longevity, as opposed to the one-off item that relies totally on a one-off sale and never sees the customer again.
He calls them whiz-bang products. Here today, gone tomorrow. Here tomorrow is something else from Nolan Bushnell, creator of the electronic cat. It won't be ready for this Christmas, but in 1987 he is promising Tech Force. Imagine a computer game, but instead of the players being on the screen, they're on your floor.
They're actually little play pieces that run around your living room floor. You can control up to 16 off of one computer console. They can be soccer figures or race cars or space vehicles. Doesn't matter. You've heard of Star Wars. Well, this is Floor Wars.
And if your children get bored talking to Teddy while they wait for Tech Force, get 2 or 3 Teddies and they'll talk to each other all alone.
Hugh Sykes doing his Christmas toy shopping. I think as far as I'm concerned, it'll be Scrabble as usual this Christmas. You've been listening to Outlook. Thank you very much for joining us. For the moment, from me, John Tidmarsh, goodbye.